Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Polly Peters. I'm the co-chair of the Adult Ed Council, as I'm sure most of you know by now. Welcome to session 1 of our 3-week class. Starts today, Resilience, Respect, and Resilience, Respect, and Resistance. Being the church in uncertain times. Okay, so this class will go on for 3 weeks, and we are absolutely thrilled to be joined today with Matt Helms and Nanette Sawyer as our very capable leaders. So thank you both. Looking ahead, you should be reading the book James by Percival Everett, which we will begin discussing on February 16th with John Clum and Jeff Doan. And you also may want to brush up on Huckleberry Finn, your knowledge of Huckleberry Finn, in case it's been too many years since you've read that. So without further ado, let's take our seats. As an opening prayer this morning, I'd like to read a poem. It's by Irish theologian, poet, and adherent of Celtic spirituality, John O'Donoghue, and it's entitled For Courage. When the light around you lessens and your thoughts darken until your body feels fear turn cold as a stone inside, when you find yourself bereft of any belief in yourself and all you unknowingly leaned on has fallen, when one voice commands your whole heart and it is raven dark, steady yourself and see that it is your own thinking that darkens your world. Search and you will find a diamond thought of light. Know that you are not alone and that this darkness has purpose. Gradually, it will school your eyes to find the one gift your life requires, hidden within this night corner. Invoke the learning of every suffering you have suffered. Close your eyes. Gather all the kindling about your heart to create one spark. That is all you need to nourish the flame that will cleanse the dark of its weight of festered fear. A new confidence will come alive to urge you toward higher ground, where your imagination will learn to engage difficulty as its most rewarding threshold. Amen.
Just checking for an echo, that's all. That was it, excellent. Well, first, I just want to start out this class by saying thank you all for being here and entering into this conversation that I know has been going on, will continue going on. And also just extending a thanks for grace, as we all are doing something that's inherently difficult and fraught, and that is trying to make sense of the present in real time. It's never an easy thing, but I think it's so incredibly important at this particular season that we find ourselves in. But as we'll get into, it's not just about this season, but about how we as a church community are always in interaction with the wider world and culture around us. And that grounding is a particular thing I think we want to lift up at the outset. So the seeds, or sort of the inspiration of this class, did come out of the November election and what we as pastoral staff were hearing, some of which we had shared previously in a letter that had gone out, that we had dozens of conversations with members who were feeling frightened, upset, uncertain. And I know that in the wake of the inauguration and the flurry of executive orders and lawsuits against those and everything that has been going on this past week, a lot of those exact same feelings are coming up again. We recognize that as congregation, we are continually asking ourselves, what are we called to do in this season? What are we as the church to do? And I think that that is an incredibly appropriate question, but it's also one that we need to go a few layers deeper on and think about ourselves as individuals as well. The other thing, though, that I want to say in framing this class at the start is we hope that what we're discussing is bigger than just thinking about these next 4 years. One of the things that Nanette and I and the other associate pastors were talking about is that we are always in conversation with our wider culture, and there will always be things that feel ultimately out of our control. We think about intractable problems like hunger, poverty, gun violence, things that we as a congregation have deep feelings about, that we do our best to serve and witness and ministry to, but that ultimately remain unsolved. And so recognizing whatever piece we have to play in this, we are just a small part of a wider whole. So while we may have started, the seeds of this may have been thinking about the current moment, we hope that this class will be a little bit bigger than that as we go on, and thinking about the interaction between church and culture more broadly, and about how we discern our call in every particular season that we find ourselves in, what it means to be church. The other thing that I want to say in framing is that we know for a fact that we are not all of one mind here. That is only natural. It would be hard to be a 3,000 member church and have everyone be thinking about these things the same way. But it's important that we don't pretend that we are all of one opinion. That has been the reality of every church community going back to the first century. That has not stopped the church from being the church over the past 2 millennia. In fact, the earliest letter that we likely have, scholars are split between 1 Thessalonians or Galatians. But if you take Galatians, many believe to be the first letter, it was written to a church dispute. It was an argument in churches about how best to be witnessing in ministry. And I imagine those conversations will be continuing, not just over these next 4 years, but moving ahead. We feel genuinely called to be a light in this city, to be a light in our wider country, and we together are going to be figuring out what that means and how we are going to live into that. Now, I do want to say that this class, even though we'll be coming to some sort of collective and shared understandings, we don't want this class to be about ignoring or papering over disagreements or divisions that we might be experiencing under the guise of unity. Instead, this class is about how we individually and collectively respond as the church to this season, discerning our personal sense of response, as well as that shared sense of mission. And so for the purposes of this class today, before we move in future classes a little bit broader, a lot of what Nanette and I are going to be focusing on is our own personal discernment as individuals before Joe and Rocky help to take us broader in the coming weeks. So I hope that's helpful as we get into this topic. So as the other associates and I started discussing how we might frame the entirety of the series, the first thing actually that we came to within the first minute was this probably one of the most well-known prayers of the 20th century, this prayer from Reinhold Niebuhr. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. This prayer at this point is very much familiar and associated with AA meetings, beginning with this prayer, but it's one that works in a wide variety of contexts. You may not know, however, that there is actually more to this prayer from this simple one. You'll find the full thing listed in your handout. You adds on living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as Christ did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, and trusting that Christ will make all things right. After that goes, if I surrender to his will, if I'm remembering the quote correctly. All right, yeah, well, we're good. So I particularly love that "not as I would have it" phrase. How many of us feel that exact same thing every day? This world is not as I would have it. And yet, for the purposes of this framing, this idea of balancing serenity and courage, wisdom and discernment, today we're hoping to walk through sort of a 3-part structure of thinking about how we find serenity and acceptance, even in situations where we might fundamentally disagree, where we can find imagination and courage to spark a belief that our wider culture can be changed, and wisdom and discernment practices so that we know where and when we're called to. And so that is the wider framing that we are going to take in our class today. And so I hope that that is helpful. We stress over and over when we share this prayer that this prayer is not one that is preaching passivity. There is an acceptance, absolutely yes, of things that are bigger than us that we cannot change. But there is a courage to change those things we can as well. And even if we don't know what that means in this exact moment, we remain open to what will be and trust we will soon know what is to be. And there are also times when we genuinely won't know the difference between what we change and what we can't. And so in all of this, I hope we as a community extend grace to ourselves in our collective discernment as we seek to live out our faith as best we can. And I know that we're certainly going to be praying for God to grant us the wisdom to know that difference. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nanette, who is going to open us thinking about the serenity and acceptance portion.
Thank you, Matt. So, yes, serenity, courage, and wisdom, our three themes for today. So, first, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. As Matt mentioned, this prayer does not encourage passivity, yet, this is the line that could be interpreted to be about passivity. But in fact, I think that if we really tap into the power of serenity, that it can give us a great deal of power in order to change the things that we can when we get into later portions of the prayer. So we have to keep thinking holistically about the whole prayer, even when we take a deep dive into one or the other of the parts of it. So in serenity, there is strength. In serenity, we remember who we are. In serenity, we remember who we belong to, whose we are, and what we are part of. In serenity, we remember that we are never alone and that we are not lost, but that we are beautiful and beloved simply because we are created by God, simply because we exist. In a few minutes, I'm going to do a little spiritual practice exercise with us to look for an experience of serenity. But first, a little more analysis, a few more words. So the prayer asks for serenity for a purpose, for the purpose of accepting the things that we cannot change. So acceptance is the second part of this first bit in the triad. So I have been reading a book this week that has been helping me a lot by Bishop Marianne Edgar Buddy. Now, Tom mentioned this in his sermon. So nice synchronicity there. After the bishop made her sermon last Sunday, I and thousands of other people went to Amazon to buy her book. It was sold out, so I only got it on Kindle, but it has been helping me this week. One of the things that she writes about is acceptance, accepting what we did not choose and cannot change is one of the most courageous decisions we make and the most difficult. So I love how she frames this, what we did not choose and cannot change. And she goes on to say, when faced with a terrible situation, denial is often our first response as our brains struggle to take in an unwanted new reality. When the facts stubbornly persist, we do whatever we can to avert the outcome we most dread. This is instinctual, for we were created for life. So, in this category of the things that we do not choose and cannot change, there are things like illnesses, death, loss of loved ones, our own mortality, other people. Let's think about that for a minute. We cannot change other people as much as we want to. Injustices, we don't choose them and we can't change them in the moment. They are there. So the bishop goes on to say, even the serenity prayer, with its emphasis on accepting things we cannot change, also exhorts us to change the things we can. But we generally don't get to that acceptance until we've exhausted all other options, right? We want to be in control and we want to fix things right now. Acceptance can look like passivity or resignation, she says, as Matt got said in the beginning, but it's not these things. For an acceptance, we actively engage with whatever we're faced with, precisely because this is what we're faced with. This is it. There's no turning away and there's no turning back. And we want our resistance to be powerful and effective. We don't want to be just spinning our wheels. We don't want to be flailing about in anger and feeling overwhelmed. So we have to take a look at how we are using our energy. Acceptance does not mean that we have to participate in the things that we think are wrong. We do not have to support them. We do not have to submit to those things that we cannot change. But we can realize that what is happening, we need to realize what it is that we're facing so that we can adequately respond to it. Acceptance of what is means that when you choose to respond, when we choose to respond, we are actually responding to what is really happening rather than to what we wish was happening or what we fear is happening. So let's think about this, a little thought experiment. When we encounter something that we feel is wrong or unjust, we may have this initial reaction of rejecting that thing. And emotions may rise up in us like anger or dismay, arguments about why things should be different or how they should be instead of how they actually are. We have all this going on inside of us. And if we keep looking deeper into those feelings, well, what's behind that feeling? What is making me feel that way? Maybe we get to that sense of powerlessness that's behind it, where a metaphor might be that we feel like we're backed up against the wall and we want to lash out. We feel defensive. The root feeling is almost like a panicky, no. That feeling is behind it, and that's connected to a sense of powerlessness. Watching the news can bring on this feeling. But all those other situations that I named before can bring on this feeling. Lashing out against things that feel wrong or unjust or even frightening, it's totally human. It's totally understandable. But generally, it's not very effective at changing things. This lashing out also uses up a ton of our energy and keeps us spinning and distracted. And if we think about it, maybe a little bit of it feels good. Because when we're in fight mode, the endorphins go and the adrenaline gets running and we know we're right. And then we get entrenched in our position. So we got to recognize, well, sometimes this horrible thing feels good, but it's not really good for us. It's not really going to help us move forward. Now, anger is not a bad thing in and of itself. And anger can keep us alive. So we got to honor anger. We just have to watch it and understand where it comes from so that we can decide if and how we want to use it. Anger can give us the will to live sometimes. Anger can save our life, but also sometimes we can have a kind of life-saving anger, but our lives are not really threatened in that moment. It's a mismatch, and we're using up all that energy against not, it's mismatched, and it's really an expression of our anxiety spinning in anxiety. So if we get sucked into this kind of emotional vortex, it tends to be very exhausting, and we can fall into that powerlessness, overwhelmed, despair, numbness. We can slip into avoidance and denial about whatever's happening. We look away, we never want to look back. So here's a little more from Bishop Buddy. Acceptance, unlike avoidance or denial, never looks away from suffering, but rather faces it directly and seeks to place it within a larger narrative. Such is the courage of acceptance, to look directly at what we dread and trust that we can survive. So, serenity and acceptance. Other examples, the hurricanes that happened on the East Coast, the fires on the West Coast, the political happenings, looking right in them, things we would never choose, but things we can't change, we can't go back. These things are real and happening. So I want to take us into a little spiritual practice, looking for serenity within ourselves. I invite you to get comfortable. We're going to take a good few minutes to look for this experience of serenity. I'm going to invite you to just become aware of your body, and if you can let your body relax a little bit more deeply, maybe take a nice deep breath and make a nice long out breath, just pushing all the air out of your lungs so that when you relax, your body just breathes automatically. Our bodies know how to breathe. And think about the vastness of the night sky, that beautiful velvety blackness, that darkness, like a warmth, like love, like a soft and solid strength of that huge night sky. And understand that we are part of that that is here with us, but it is also somehow inside us. Imagine that vastness is at the core of your being. Just take a moment to imagine that beautiful, deep blue, rich, warm love with the, the tiny pinpricks of light. And rest in the silence of that vastness. Rest in the source of all creation. Rest in the source of true existence, that we are so interconnected with that vast beauty and power. Rest in the protection of the vastness of God. This is a source of rejuvenation, a source of blessing. Let that night wrap you like a warm blanket. Let it fill your spirit and body and carry you into a deeper peace. And now I share with you another image, thinking about depth and vastness. We can think about the deep, deep ocean. How, too, that is a beautiful part of God's creation. And it is part of us, and we are part of it. Imagine that you are the depths of the deepest ocean. So large, so strong, so deep, so peaceful. And thoughts and feelings flicker through your existence like the light bouncing off the waves at the top of the ocean, but you dwell in a deeper place where there is stillness. And that stillness is God's love. God created the world, and God created us, and we are together. We are part of it. The light that bounces off the surface, it's not heavy to the waves. It's not heavy to the ocean. It's very light. So the thoughts and feelings that come to us, very light, not heavy. Because we, our existence, our presence is much deeper and stronger and stiller, more still. Take a moment to just remember this sensation. See how it reverberates through your body, or how it makes your heart feel, how it makes your mind feel. And then start to rise up from those depths of the ocean and come back up toward the light of this room and this world. I invite you to come back into your body here and think about the chair in which you sit. And bring that serenity with you as you come back here. And start to wiggle your fingers and your toes and come back into your body. Start to be aware of the light shining even through your eyelids. And when you're ready, you can start to flutter your eyes and open them to see where we are now. And I invite you to just snap your fingers, everybody, because we're just getting back in our bodies and we're coming back into this space and we're going to think about thoughts now. That was very experiential and deep. So it takes a moment to come back, but remember that feeling and remember that you have spiritual tools that you can use like this. Visualizations for some visual learners, but it could be a description of a physical sensation if you're more of a kinesthetic learner. What does it feel like in my body? So many tools that we have. I'm going to end my little section here on serenity with just one more quote from Bishop Buddy. She wrote, "Acceptance remains the hardest things, I think it's one of the hardest things asked of us. The price is always high, but in the face of what we would never choose and cannot change, acceptance provides a way forward." So when we have that serenity, that strength, that grounding inside us, it gives us the power to be able to accept those things we would never choose and cannot change. And that allows us to begin to move forward. And when we move forward, we move into courage and discernment. We move into changing the things that we can. So I'm going to invite Pastor Matt to come back up here with us.
I'm so very grateful for that gift of peace because that does not come easily to me. I don't know if that's the case to many of you, but grateful for that. In thinking of building on this foundation of peace and acceptance, that serenity in the face of things we cannot change, we turn now to things we may be able to. When a lot of us, myself included, hear that word change, I think the first thing that we jump to is action and doing. Making changes. That's certainly how I tend to approach things. But scholars and thinkers have been wonderful in helping to reshape that for me and saying that change isn't grounded in doing, it's first grounded in our thinking and feeling and being able to envision an alternative to what is. If we have an acceptance of what is, part of our call as Christians, of followers of Christ, is to envision an alternative to what is, to think about what could be, and that we do that grounded in a shared understanding of what it is that our faith is calling us to. And one of the books for me that has been instrumental in helping me do this, it's almost 50 years old at this point, but continues to feel as rich in the present as it did when it was first published. Many of you are familiar with the work of Walter Brueggemann. He's a friend of the congregation. I believe you may have even been fortunate enough to hear him speak here at some point. But this book, The Prophetic Imagination, is one at the risk of oversimplifying, one in which Dr. Brueggemann is suggesting that part of the role of us as individuals and also as the church is that we are being called into the role of the biblical prophets, that we are meant to cultivate an alternative imagination about our wider culture. When Brueggemann was writing it, I think he had in mind specifically things like consumerism or affluence. But what he wrote has proved remarkably resilient in all sorts of different eras and critiques we might make of our wider culture. And so for me, this book continues to be one that I turn to when I think about how do we have imagination and courage in this season that we're in. And I'll go ahead and share one of my favorite quotes of the book that I think in some ways sums up his thesis quite well. It's long, but it's worth reading in its entirety. That the prophet engages in futuring fantasy. The prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. And then also building on that, the task of prophetic ministry, and in this case he is meaning the ministry of the church, is to nurture and nourish and to evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. This alternative consciousness will both criticize and energize. So as you can tell, it's a little bit of a dense book, to be fair, but highly recommend you digging into it because it is well worth a read and a reread. But that structure of criticizing and energizing provides a frame that Brueggemann spends multiple chapters building on of the role that we are called to play. Now, that criticism language may strike you as overly harsh or negative, and so I want to do a little reframing on that he offers. For him, this criticism is not meant strictly to be negative, but is instead meant to shake us from numbness and apathy, what he sees as a sense of, perhaps he would even say, overly accepting that which is, to, in his words, in Jeremiah and in Isaiah, we see them use this language of grief and lament as they look out at their culture, a culture that in some ways is broken, in which people are being treated poorly, in which even the church is complicit in doing so. And they reclaim this language of grief and lament and even death as a way through that hyperbole of shaking people out of numbness and apathy. I don't know if any of you are like this, but I will occasionally go on several day benders of reading the news as much as I can, and then I hit a point where I cannot do it for a second longer and step away. I think that's only natural. But I think what Brueggemann is calling us to is a reminder that even if we are not meant to be scrolling articles endlessly every day, we cannot allow ourselves to remain numb or apathetic to accept what is, to always have that spark and that criticism, to reclaim that role of the prophets to say, what is perhaps should not be. And then part of the other crucial role of the prophet, one that you see them in almost every single one of the prophetic texts take, not only are they criticizing their culture, they're seeking to energize. They're reclaiming symbols of hope and power, symbols of rebirth. You see that whether it's Ezekiel and the dry bones, this sort of miracle of life coming in the midst of death. You see in third Isaiah, or towards the end of the book of Isaiah, this hope of a renewal and rebuilding. These these powerful symbols of hope are incredible and amazing. And as he continues on in the book, he goes on to lift up Jesus's ministry and ends up focusing much of his time there. It's a really interesting thing I think we sometimes are so familiar with aspects of Jesus' ministry that we forget how incredibly radical his prophetic imagination was. I think about, especially with the parables. The parables are perhaps a paradigmatic example of prophetic imagination. Who is my neighbor? And the Good Samaritan. It's a parable all of us have likely heard dozens of times, and yet when you step back and think about the power of that prophetic imagination, this tearing down of our understanding of who is our neighbor and to imagine something greater. What a beautiful image, what a beautiful imagination. Things like that are what Brueggemann is lifting up as examples of what it means to have this imagination and vision. And he goes on to talk about discussions with the Pharisees and Sadducees that sort of push back against the religious leaders of his day. And even in his very life, death, and resurrection, these symbols of hope that all of us claim and know, and this belief that even in the midst of death and suffering, life can come again. I think for a lot of us, sometimes we have a hard time accepting that or believing it. But there is such a power to that idea and to such a power to that reality that even when things it looks like there is no way out of what is, as Brueggemann says, that prophetic imagination calls us to continually be dreaming more than what is and into what could be. And I love in the way that he closes the book that this isn't just an intellectual exercise for him. The prophetic imagination is something to be put into practice. As he says, in the end, the prophetic imagination is not simply a good idea, it's concrete practices undertaken by real believers who share the conviction of grief and hope that escape the restraints of the dominant culture. For him, he lifts up the act of praying, whether that's in worship as we confess, whether for our individual sins or more corporately. That act of confession is an act of shaking us out of numbness, of recognizing that all of us do have culpability and are part of this wider system. I'll never forget, we, years back, heard from someone who said they don't say the parts of the prayer of confession that they don't think apply to them. And we had to sit down and talk about how it's not just about us as individuals. We're recognizing a brokenness in all of us and recognizing that even if we may not think we're sharing in pieces of this prayer, all of us collectively do. And there's a power in doing and saying that prayer weekly as a reminder that there is brokenness within us, that confession that shakes us from numbness and apathy, as well as in the prayers of the people as we lift up all of the places of challenge that are in our world today, again, that helps to criticize in some ways and spark. And then you also find that imagination and hope as you turn and read scripture. Brueggemann emphasizes we may not think of reading scripture as a radical act or an act of criticism or energizing, but for him, returning to the biblical text, claiming these shared symbols of hope and vision, what could be more powerful for us as a church? It's one of the things that binds us together as a church family, even with political division. We still find hope in the parables, find hope in Jesus' message, find hope in the prophets, find hope in all of the biblical witness that is helping to lead us forward into believing and imagining a time when all people are truly known as beloved children of God. And finally, Brueggemann goes on to talk about how acts of compassion, we may not think of those as being things that are serving to criticize, but he talks about compassion and compassion for others as sort of the ultimate criticism of looking at a culture or a society that doesn't care for those on the margins. That act of compassion is saying, we do care. When you come in for a Sunday night supper, when you come in to receive clothing or whatever else it may be, we care. You are part of our church family too. And those acts of compassion are one of the grounding points, the concrete practices that we bring. It may seem so small in the midst of all that is going on in our wider world, but as I know Nanette is going to share, there is such a power to them as well, such a beauty. And those individual acts add up as a community. I know that sometimes we think of this courage language and feel like what we are doing might not be courageous, that we only feel like courage is being on the front lines of advocacy or doing frontline work for justice. I would say there's a lot of other ways to be courageous. It takes courage to say yes to being a tutor because you envision a world in which this child is supported and surrounded by a community. You have genuine compassion. That takes courage. Having conversations with those you disagree with takes courage. Volunteering as a Sunday school teacher or a youth leader takes courage. Speaking to hope in times that feel hopeless takes courage. And using our prophetic imaginations, being able to envision a world beyond what is and into what could be, takes courage. But it takes even more courage to be able to act on them. And that's part of what we will continue to reflect on.
God grant me the wisdom to know the difference between things I can change and the things I cannot change. This part of the prayer is about discernment. It's about choosing how we will act and when we will act. It's a prayer for insight about the impact of our actions. I saw some people with a sign a while back that said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. Yep. It's good, right? It's very witty. It takes this well-known prayer and kind of flips it in an interesting way and makes you think about your agency, your capacity to change things. It helps us think about what do we accept that shouldn't be accepted? You know, so there's different kinds of acceptance, right? There's this deep spiritual accepting what is as what is and not flailing about against it. But there's this other like social acceptance where we let some things slide that we actually could change. And so this little flipped sign that I saw, I'm no longer accepting. Well, I am changing the things I cannot accept, that part. That is a call to action. That's really a call to courage. It's a call to the second part of the prayer and to the third part of the prayer, having wisdom on being able to discern what are the things that we need to accept and what are the things that we need to change. And we can change. We have the power of influence to change things. So, how can we know the difference? Sometimes we grow so passive and accept those things that should be changed. Now, the serenity portion of the prayer is about getting in touch with the best portion of ourselves, our best selves, and getting in touch with the power that resides within us so that we can use that power to discern and to make changes. And the prophetic imagination can help us have that idea and get to that place of courage. But the serenity part helps us to slow down and not be reactionary. We want to be responsive, not reactionary. So that's one of the concepts of this whole prayer when you put it all together. Another book that I've been enjoying is this book called Humankind, Changing the World One Small Act at a Time by Brad Aronson. Aronson holds up a story after story, actually. His book is all stories about human kindness and how it changes things. He tells one story about a neighborly friendship that was expressed toward a Muslim community in Minnesota in 2017 when hostility was growing towards the Muslim community. One day when the youth director arrived at the mosque, he found that someone had tied a large paper heart on the plants outside the door, along with a pink envelope addressed to our friends and neighbors. And inside was a note that read, "Dear friends, thank you for being here. You make all of us stronger, better, and kinder. May peace be with us all." Now, that act of kindness changed something very significant in how that community was loving itself and each other. That kindness to the neighbors was a beautiful antidote to the violence and threats and fear and hostility that was rising up in the community. It's a great example of changing the world one kindness at a time. And maybe it took courage, but also it probably encouraged the Muslim community that was there. So when we're thinking about what can and cannot be changed, considering when someone has a terrible illness or injury and we can't make that illness or injury go away, but we can change their experience of it. We can change their day. And Aronson gives ideas like do something small, do something specific, schedule your time that you want reminders, schedule reminders about people you want to check in on. He tells another story in the book about a young girl who experienced a lot of trauma as a small child, and she spent many years in the foster care system. On her 15th birthday, she got called to the conference room where youths usually met with their probation officers. She thought she was in trouble. But when she walked in the room, it was filled with balloons and a sign saying, "Happy birthday." No one had ever celebrated her birthday before. She was 15 years old. And that birthday party changed the trajectory of her life. One room full of balloons, some cards and presents changed the trajectory of her life. And the people who threw that birthday party, they didn't in that moment change the foster care system, you know? Although they probably still kept working on changing the foster care system. It's not either or. But how much a little act of kindness and thoughtfulness and thinking through what people might benefit from or what they might need or long for, how can we provide some of those things? So changing something isn't always fixing the whole big thing, but it's still a change. It's still changing people's experience of life. So we want to have wisdom in discerning where our actions can have impact and where our energy can be effectively directed. One more quote from Bishop Buddy. "The courage to be brave when it matters most requires a lifetime of small decisions," and that's what we're talking about in the Human Kindness book. A lifetime of small decisions that set us on a path of self-awareness and attentiveness and a willingness to risk failure for what we believe is right. It is also a profoundly spiritual experience, one in which we feel we are part of something larger than ourselves and guided somehow by a larger spirit at work in the world and through us. Decisive moments is what she writes about. And that was a decisive moment in the life of the girl who got the 15-year birthday party. Decisive moments make believers out of everyone. For no matter what name we give to it, the inexplicable, unmerited experience of a power greater than our own working through us is real. That power is real. And that's what we're trying to tap into in our practices of serenity and acceptance. The audacious truth, she says, is that we matter in the realization of all that is good and noble and true. And so if we pull out spiritual practices from this book on practices that foster wisdom, a lifetime of small decisions, keep making those decisions for kindness, mercy, and justice. Walking a path of self-awareness, attentiveness. Keep doing those spiritual practices. Embracing a willingness to risk failure for what we believe is right. Keep taking those steps. And from the Human Kindness book, at the end of every chapter, he has a little box that says, take 15 minutes to do this practice. So one of the chapters says, who do you know who could use a lift? Write their names on a piece of paper or type it into your phone. How will you let them know you're thinking about them? Mull it over. You can send a text, a gift card, a book, anything else you think they'd appreciate. And if you don't have the time to do something now, mark the dates on your calendar when you'll send your support to the people on your list. Human kindness is changing the world, one act at a time, not necessarily fixing everything, but changing everything we touch.
So to close, I love that framing of a lifetime of small decisions, because the reality is discernment is never a finished process for any of us. It's kind of like our book of confessions in that way, actually. There are times when our faith compels us to clarify what our prophetic imagination is, when that stands in contrast to our current culture, and perhaps we are in such a time right now. But I would argue that we are always in a time like that. As long as there are those on the margins or a society that's plagued with inequity, we will never be truly satisfied. And so we as followers of Christ, we as the church, continue to be called again and again to live compassionate lives, to foster understanding where we can, to repair places of brokenness and whatever else it is that we discern ourselves called to in this season. And even though I know we are in a wider season when we're talking and thinking a lot about division, I truly believe that there is so much from our faith that we have a shared commitment to, from genuine compassion for others to a commitment to building a world that more better resembles the one that Jesus was prophesying of. And ultimately, that's what binds all of us who are here in this room together as individuals into the church. And it's what inspires us to go outside of our walls into our wider community. So that's going to be the subject of our future sessions. Joe Morrow will be discussing our topic about foundational values for public life before Rocky closes, and thinking about the intersection of church and our wider culture. But we wanted to leave at least 10 minutes. I know you'll have to extend us some grace, but Nanette and I would love to do the best we can to open this up for question and answer and an opportunity. I know that there is a lot going on in all of our heads in this time, and we would love to be in conversation and dialogue with you all. So if anyone has any questions or thoughts they'd like to share.
Thank you, Matt and Nanette. I really liked what you said about Brueggemann, lamented grief, you know. But I'm going to add something else. I would add mourning, to mourn. And I mean mourning from the depths of your soul. And you can only mourn when you have faced and accept what has happened. Now, in my worldview, America has lost 1 million people in the pandemic. I do not see that on the front page of the New York Times, how we mourn that. That's just an example. But you know what I do for a living. I'm a psychiatrist and a child psychiatrist. And the only way to go past whatever you got coming at you, not only to do like Bishop Buddy says, acceptance and face it, but to really feel it and mourn it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Annette.
I wanted to add something about courage. If you want to have courage, it's really good to help your children with that. And it begins very small. When I was a nanny, I had a little boy who would always look to me if someone took his toys away in the sandbox. It sounds stupid, but it was very important that he learned to stick up for himself. And we would role play it, and we would go over it and over it and over it until he was able to stand up and say, I had that first, give it back. And what I want to say in my own life is I had examples of people who are courageous. My grandmother. I would say my grandmother was the most generous person I have ever met. And during the war, she was about 6 blocks from the railroad, but they knew that she cooked and would give them food, and they would come to her, and she would give them what they needed. And I'm saying this because sometimes you can give people what they need, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to save something for yourself. And that is very hard to do, especially if you work in a movement or are trying to change a huge understanding of what it means to feed the homeless, say.
Yes, thank
And
you.
when that happens, it's important to be able to do it.
Thanks. Okay, Catherine, and then I see in the back.
First of all, thanks to the psychiatrist for adding the morning piece, because I think the morning piece is important. And without going into detail, I will say I have been battling a difficult situation, both with my husband who's in hospice and my own illness. And I felt like I had permission from him because I was mourning. And what was most helpful in this, and I think for all of us, we should think about how to engage with. And I'm coming out of the morning, and with actually Fourth Church, just coming to these meetings has helped me so much. And I thank all of you for your kindness. And I am coming out of mourning and into engagement largely because of my relationships at Fourth Church.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so
Mhm.
much. Someone was back here?
Yes.
I was going to say one thing that has helped me through the years. I've been blessed by following and looking at Jimmy Carter and the way he lived his life. And what he said once about anger and about lust, and how anger in your heart, hating people, is the same as killing them. And so there's such a difference between righteous anger, which is what you have described, and the anger towards hating people. And how to make that break between the two of them is what we're learning here today. So
Yes, very well said. Anger can save us or it can destroy us. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Sorry, I'll mute to respond. Thank you.
I've been in development work for a couple decades, and you see everything in the developing world that's going wrong, and you could get very down. And I basically look at what we are doing, not what we aren't doing. And I think it's just it's another practice to help energize and, everybody's is doing something and can do something and to focus on that.
Yeah, I think that that perspective setting work is really important, especially when you're facing things of a scope and scale that you could never, as individuals or even as a wider community, hope to change. But that doesn't exempt us from being in the midst of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So one of the things, if you follow Facebook, is there's such a divisiveness, and I don't respect anyone who made that decision. But there are so many people in my life that I love and respect and are such kind, wonderful people that hold different political views. And the hardest thing for me is to stop, take a breath. I wish I could say to those people, stop hating, stop being so vicious. We are all loving, caring people. We look at it differently. This is really hard. What's hard is, do I sit back and quietly accept that they're feeling bad? Do I try and change their opinion, which seems very judgy? That's what's hard for me. I sit in the middle of all these people I love with such extreme views,
Yeah.
and it's hard. What do I say? Do I sit and just pray? Some people say praying's the lazy way out, but I am such a strong believer in prayer. I guess that's where I sit right now, but it's really hard when you have so many people you respect with such differing viewpoints.
No, I really appreciate that, and I would echo: prayer is not the lazy way out. it's, again, it's that act of shaking us to make us care more deeply, to envision a better world. So, prayer side, I experienced what you just shared in my own family as well. I know probably almost everyone here does to some degree, and it's really genuinely hard to not be reactive, I think was the word that you had used, Annette. It's hard because we can feel ourselves almost like bristling when you hear it. And I have had to very consciously, and I won't claim to be great at it all the time, but to walk that back and to be genuinely curious, to try to extend compassion and try to understand. I don't always understand, but that posture of curiosity and openness, I hope what I'm communicating to the other person, even if we don't fundamentally agree, is that I still have that genuine caring for them, and I hope that they feel willing to continue that dialogue in the future, knowing that it may not change this year, 5 years down the line, but change does happen. And I've experienced that in my family, of people who I used to disagree with. A decade down the line, we come back and have different dialogue, and all of us are constantly growing and changing. And so to have that foundation of saying, I genuinely care about you, let's continue the talk. I think that's the best we can do in this time. Sure.
Yeah, ditto all of that. Struggling, living into it, trying to work it out myself. Sometimes one of the tools I use is asking curious questions and trying to find out what is behind that belief with which I disagree. Um, you know, what is it that you're concerned about that makes you believe that? Or what is it that you are hoping for? Trying to find out what's the underlying value, or what are your assumptions about the various factors in this, and being able to do it in this way that's responsive. And I'm in my heart, I'm still connecting with you as a beloved child of God. I'm trying to deal with the flash of anger that comes up in me and the flash of judgment that comes up in me, keeping that curiosity with a tone of respect. It is very hard work, and sometimes it's good to walk away. And especially if you get into that flared up moment, they say that it takes 20 minutes for the adrenaline to drain out of our body again. So you might need a 20-minute break before you try again to engage. Yeah. Thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions? Thank you so very much, Matt and Nanette. We truly appreciate it.